The cold on the Tibetan plateau doesn't arrive like winter. It settles in, quietly, permanently, the way a debt does. It gets into your lungs first, then your fingers, then your thinking. At 16,000 feet above sea level, the atmosphere is thin enough that even resting men breathe hard. Fires are difficult to sustain. Food tastes of nothing. The sky at night is so vast and so clear that more than one soldier has described the sensation of looking up and feeling, unmistakably, that something up there was looking back. The Tibetan people have a name for what lives in these places. They have always had names for it. Older names than any written language can record. They told outsiders very little about these things. They were wise not to. The men we are concerned with today were not Tibetan. They were German. They wore black uniforms. They carried precise instruments, scientific notebooks, and in some cases, weapons. They arrived in the spring of 1938 under orders that were partly official, partly ideological, and partly something else entirely, something that no field report would ever fully capture. Official German records described the mission as a zoological and ethnographic expedition. The men who planned it, and the men who carried it out, described it differently in private. 5 of them left Calcutta. All 5 came back. But what the expedition's internal correspondence, its classified film reels, and the post-war interrogation records suggest is that somewhere in the highlands of Tibet, in the late months of 1938, the Ahnenerbe unit of the SS encountered something it was entirely unprepared for. And that when the records were sealed in the Reich archives, something was left out. Official records call it a scientific expedition. The men who ran it call it something else. If you value real-world mysteries recovered from the fringes of history and the fringes of conflict, stay with me. To understand what happened in Tibet in 1938, you need to understand what the SS believed, and why they believed it. By the mid-1930s, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer of the SS and arguably the most ideologically obsessed of Hitler's inner circle, had established an organization unlike any other in the history of modern warfare. He called it the Ahnenerbe, which translates, roughly, as ancestral heritage. On paper, it was a research institute. In practice, it was something closer to a state-funded occult archaeology bureau. Founded in 1935, the Ahnenerbe employed archaeologists, linguists, anthropologists, astronomers, and botanists. It dispatched expeditions to Scandinavia, the Middle East, and South America. It studied Norse runes, medieval fortresses, and pre-Christian religious sites. It was looking for a single thing: proof that a master Aryan civilization had once ruled the earth, and that the German people were its rightful inheritors. The ideological framework underpinning all of this drew heavily from a body of late 19th century occultist writing. Most significantly, the works of Madame Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophy movement, filtered through the pseudoscientific theories of men like Hans Horbiger. Horbiger's Weltallehre, the world ice theory, proposed that most of the cosmos was composed of ice and that previous epochs of human civilization had been destroyed by cosmic catastrophe. It was laughed at by mainstream science. It was treated as gospel inside Himmler's operation. And then there was Agartha. The legend of Agartha, sometimes spelled Agarthi, Agartha, or a dozen other variations, describes an immense kingdom existing beneath the surface of the earth, accessible through hidden entrances scattered across the globe. Its origins as a written myth trace back to French occultist writings from the 1870s, expanded by Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedra in the 1880s, and popularized in the West by a 1922 book called Beasts, Men and Gods by a Polish adventurer named Ferdynand Ossendowski, who claimed to have heard the legend directly from Mongolian shamans. In the Nazi interpretation, Agartha was not merely a myth. It was a destination. The hidden kingdom was populated, they believed, by the ancestors of the Aryan race, a supercivilization driven underground by an ancient catastrophe, still alive, still powerful, still waiting to be contacted by their worthy descendants on the surface. Its capital was sometimes identified with Shambhala, the sacred city of Tibetan and Vedic tradition. This was not a fringe view within the SS. Himmler believed it personally. And when a young zoologist named Ernst Schäfer, already a veteran of 2 scientific expeditions through Tibet and the Sino-Tibetan borderlands, approached the SS with a proposal for a 3rd expedition to Lhasa, Himmler did not merely approve it. He made it personal. The expedition that departed Calcutta in April of 1938 consisted of 5 men. Schäfer himself, ranked SS-Sturmbannführer, was the scientific lead, an ornithologist and naturalist who had already published widely on Tibetan ecology. Alongside him, Bruno Beger, a physical anthropologist tasked with taking racial measurements of the Tibetan people, Karl Wienert, a geophysicist, Edmund Gear, who handled logistics and film, and Ernst Krauss, the expedition photographer. Their equipment was precisely calibrated. They carried scientific instruments, surveying tools, thousands of meters of film stock, and notebooks that would eventually record some 2,000 photographs, measurements of 376 Tibetan skulls, and the collected specimens of over 3,300 birds. They were, on the surface, a first-rate scientific team. But woven through the official itinerary were secondary objectives that never appeared in any documents submitted to the British colonial authorities who granted them passage. Objectives that tracked not birds but myths, not skull dimensions but doorways. Their equipment was calibrated for science. Their orders were calibrated for something older. By late October 1938, the expedition had been in Tibet for 6 months. They had reached Lhasa, been received by the Reading Regent, Tibet's acting head of state, and were making their return journey northeast through the high plateau. The temperature had dropped. The passes were becoming dangerous, and something had shifted in the internal dynamics of the team. This is where the official record and the private record begin to diverge. What follows is reconstructed from post-war interrogation transcripts, specifically the U.S. We had been camped for 3 nights at approximately 30 degrees north, 92 degrees east, a plateau shelf north of the Nine-Contangler Range. The altitude was close to 5,000 meters. The air was sharp enough to cut. We had positioned ourselves near a cluster of Mani stones, prayer markers, because Beger believed the local rock formations were geologically significant. He was taking measurements. On the second night, I was on the watch from approximately 0200 to 0400. The sky was cloudless. What I first noticed was the absence of sound. This requires some explanation. Even at altitude, even in the cold, there are sounds. When the movement of stones under frost pressure, the distant call of a chuff bird. That night there was nothing. Not silence as we understand it in cities. A different kind of silence. The kind that has a weight to it. At approximately 0330, I observed a light source moving along the northern ridgeline. This in itself was not alarming. We had seen shepherd fires before. But this light did not move like a carried torch. It moved without the vertical fluctuation of a walking man. It moved at a constant height, and it moved slowly, very slowly, as if it was reading the terrain below it. I woke Gear. He watched it for perhaps 4 minutes without speaking. Then he said quietly, "That isn't a lantern." I told him to go back to sleep. In the morning I told no one else. There was no protocol for this. There was no box on the expedition forms for the light on the ridge was not the only anomaly recorded during that phase of the expedition. 3 days later, approximately 30 kilometers further north, the expedition's radio operator, Wienert, who handled both geomagnetic readings and communications, logged an interference event that does not appear in the official expedition reports. It appears only in a footnote in his personal scientific journal, preserved in an archive in Munich. The interference occurred on the standard military frequency. It lasted 14 seconds. What made it anomalous was not the static, atmospheric interference was common at altitude. What made it anomalous was what the static contained. Gear, do you copy? Adjust the antenna bearing. I'm losing the Lhasa frequency. Over. Hello. Who is on this channel? Identify yourself. Over. Schäfer. Schäfer, come to the radio. Come now. Schäfer arrived within minutes. He listened to Wienert's account. He checked the frequency log. He did not include the incident in his daily report. Instead, he wrote a single line in German in his private notebook, a line that one of his post-war translators rendered as, "It spoke from below the ground. It spoke from below the ground." The 1938 Schäfer expedition was not the first time that outsiders had reported strange phenomena in this specific region of the Tibetan plateau. And it would not be the last. It is worth establishing a pattern. Not because each individual account is definitive, it is not, but because patterns in intelligence work as in science are data. The first data point predates the Germans by more than a decade. In 1927, a Russian painter and mystic named Nicholas Roerich led his own expedition through Central Asia, searching for Shambhala, the sacred city so closely associated in Tibetan Buddhism with the legend of Agartha. Roerich kept meticulous journals. In his published account, Altai Himalaya, he describes an event that occurred near the Humboldt Range in what is now western Mongolia, an area intersecting the same belt of high plateau that the SS expedition would later traverse. Roerich's caravan had halted for midday rest when one of his local guides, a man who had spent his entire life in these mountains, became agitated without apparent cause. He urged the caravan to move immediately. When pressed for an explanation, the guide said that the earth in this place had been opened from underneath in the past, and that men who camped here after dark heard things that changed them. Roerich himself reported hearing on the following night at approximately 0200 local time, a sound he described as a sustained subsonic resonance, felt more in the chest than heard by the ears, that continued for nearly an hour before fading. He attributed it to geological processes. His guides did not agree with that assessment. The second data point comes from within the Schäfer expedition itself, specifically from Bruno Begger's account of a conversation with a Tibetan Lama at a monastery near the Yamdrok Lake in November of 1938. The Lama, whose name Begger recorded only as Tenzin, had agreed to speak with the Germans at length about local history. Begger asked, through their interpreter, about certain cave systems in the northeastern plateau region that the expedition had been attempting to locate based on maps drawn from Ossendowski's descriptions. The Lama listened carefully. Then he said, and this is Begger's direct transcription, "You're looking for the door. Many have looked. The Mongols looked a long time ago and some of them found it and they did not return. The door is not locked from this side. It is locked from the other side. And those on the other side are not required to open it for you simply because you have arrived." Begger wrote in his diary that the Lama seemed entirely unimpressed by the Germans, their instruments, or their stated purpose. He offered them tea. He declined to say anything further on the subject. When Begger pressed him, asking what was on the other side of the door, the Lama smiled and replied, "Again, this is Begger's record. Something older than the mountains. Something that was here before the first men walked above it. Whether it is a blessing or a danger depends entirely on why you came." The third data point is more technical in nature, and comes from Wienert's geomagnetic measurements. Over the course of the expedition, Wienert conducted systematic readings of ground magnetic field variations using an Ascania field balance instrument, standard equipment for geophysical survey work. His formal published data, released years later, showed no anomalies of scientific significance in the Northeast Plateau region. His raw field notebooks, however, which were among the documents confiscated by American intelligence at the end of the war and stored in the National Archives, tell a slightly different story. On 3 separate occasions in the northeastern section of their route, Wienert recorded magnetic field readings that deviated from the expected baseline by a factor he noted as inexplicable given the local substrate. He made no theoretical claim about the cause. He simply recorded the numbers and marked the locations with small crosses on his survey map. All 3 crosses fall within an area of approximately 40 square kilometers. All 3 are in the same general plateau band. And all 3 are in locations the expedition visited immediately before the events of November 14, 1938. 3 separate anomalies. 3 separate witnesses. The same 40 square kilometers of plateau. Now, before we go further, it is important to acknowledge what responsible analysis demands. There are rational explanations for every individual element of what I've described. Altitude-induced hypoxia causes visual hallucinations in a significant percentage of unacclimatized subjects. Sleep deprivation, which all 5 expedition members were experiencing by this stage of the journey, produces auditory disturbances indistinguishable from external sounds. Radio interference at high altitude is a well-documented atmospheric phenomenon, and the Lamas of Tibet were not naive about the mythology of the plateau. They would have been well aware of the legends of Agartha and would have had every reason, religious, political, and personal, to play into the expectations of German visitors searching for exactly that mythology. These explanations are all possible, perhaps even probable, but they do not account for November 14th. November 14th, 1938. The expedition's position, northeast of the 9 Contangler Range, approximately 3 days' march from the nearest Tibetan settlement. Temperature at 2100 hours, minus 22 degrees Celsius. Wind, negligible. Sky, clear. What happened that night is the hardest part of this account to reconstruct. Not because there are no sources. There are sources. The difficulty is that the sources, 3 of them from 3 different members of the expedition, recorded at 3 different points in time, do not fully agree with each other. They agree on what they saw. They disagree in meaningful ways on what it meant. I'll start with what is not disputed. At approximately 21:30, Schäfer gave the order to break camp and begin moving. This was unusual. Night movement at altitude in late autumn was dangerous. Frostbite, falls, disorientation were all genuine risks. When Gear later asked him in post-war debrief why he had given the order, Schäfer replied only that he had believed remaining stationary was the greater risk. He was not more specific than that. Beggar's diary, however, the version with 50 copies that was not widely circulated, is somewhat more forthcoming. He writes, "At approximately 2100 I was reviewing specimens when the temperature in my tent dropped sharply, not gradually as it does before weather, but instantly as if something cold had passed through the canvas. I stepped outside. The others were already standing outside their tents. No one had called out. No signal had been given. We had simply all come out at the same time for reasons none of us could articulate afterward. The ground to the northeast was illuminated. Not by the moon was behind the western peaks. Illuminated by something beneath. I write this knowing how it reads. I am an anthropologist, not a mystic. I am recording what 5 trained observers saw with unimpaired vision at close range for a duration of approximately 8 minutes. The illumination was consistent, not flickering like fire, not moving like a carried light. A steady, pale luminescence rising from the earth itself, from an area perhaps 300 meters away. The color was difficult to describe. Not white, not blue. Something between the two, with a quality of depth to it, as though the light was coming from very far below. We stood and watched. No one spoke. Wienert had his instrument kit. He opened it, then closed it again without taking a measurement. Later, when I asked him why, he said he didn't know. Kraus had his camera ready. He did not take a photograph. Schäfer watched for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he said quietly in German, "Break camp. Now." He did not raise his voice. He did not explain. We broke camp in the dark in minus 20 degrees and walked for 4 hours until he allowed us to stop. The next morning we did not speak about it. I recorded it here because I believe it should exist somewhere. I don't know what it was. I know what it was not. It was not fire. It was not a shepherd's lamp. It was not a hallucination shared simultaneously by 5 independent observers. Beyond that, I am unable to tell you. Kraus, the expedition photographer, was interrogated separately by American military intelligence in 1946. His account of the same night is brief. 1 paragraph. In it he says the following. There was a light from the ground. Schäfer gave the order to move. I followed the order. I do not know what the light was, and I have concluded that not knowing is acceptable. I have also concluded that Schäfer knew more than he told us. Whether that is a condemnation or simply an observation, I leave to whoever reads this. Schäfer himself never formally addressed the incident. His book about the expedition, published in 1950 under the title Festival of the White Gauze Scarves, covers the entire Northeast Plateau phase of the journey in less than 2 pages. A striking compression for a man who wrote at great length about birdwatching, botanical specimens, and the habits of yak herders. Those 2 pages contain no mention of November 14th. The American interrogation report on Schäfer, OIFIR number 32, dated February 12, 1946, runs to 37 pages. It covers the expedition's findings in considerable scientific detail. There is a single paragraph near the end, in a section marked with the stamp restricted pending review, that has been partially redacted in the declassified copy. What remains visible reads, Subject was asked whether, during the northeastern plateau phase of the expedition, he or any team member observed phenomena inconsistent with known geophysical processes. Subject paused for an extended period before responding. He then stated that he had observed and that his judgment at the time was that He declined to speculate further and requested that this portion of the debrief be treated as classified at the highest available level. This request was noted. The relevant portion of this report has been submitted separately to. Whatever Schäfer said in those redacted lines has not, to date, been declassified. The Ahnenerbe archives were seized by Allied forces at the end of the war. The bulk of them were transferred to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Researchers who have worked through those archives, and several serious historians have, report that the files for the Schäfer expedition are largely intact. Largely. A small subsection of the files, described in the archive's own index as pertaining to supplementary observations, Northeast Plateau Phase, October to November 1938, is listed as present in the 1946 catalog. In the 1960 catalog, the same subsection is listed as removed for separate classification. In the current publicly accessible archive index, it does not appear at all. It has not been transferred. It has not been destroyed. According to the archive's own records, it exists. It is simply not available. It exists. It is simply not available. There is one final detail that does not fit neatly into any of the other categories, rational or otherwise. In 1943, Schäfer was given his own institute within the Ahnenerbe, the Sven Hedin Institute for Inner Asian Research. He spent the rest of the war there working on botanical genetics and grain studies from Tibetan seed specimens. By all accounts, he was good at his work and kept his head down. But in 1942, before the institute was formally established, Schäfer wrote a memo to Himmler that was recovered in the personal papers of Wolfram Sievers, the Ahnenerbe's administrative director. The memo is primarily bureaucratic in nature, budget requests, personnel issues. But in the final paragraph, apparently unprompted by anything in the preceding text, Schäfer writes, "I want to be clear about one thing, Reichsfuhrer. Whatever is beneath those plateaus, and I believe something is, it is not waiting to be found. It is waiting to be left alone. I strongly advise that no further expeditions be sent to the northeastern coordinates. Not for scientific purposes. Not for any purposes. What we disturbed should be allowed to settle again. The cost of disturbing it further is not one I am willing to calculate." Himmler did not respond to this paragraph in writing. Whether he responded in other ways is unknown. No further Ahnenerbe expedition was sent to those coordinates. Whether that was Himmler's decision, the war's disruption, or something else entirely, the record does not say. War is, among other things, a machine for generating the unverifiable. It displaces people across terrain they do not understand, under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress, in darkness, in fear, with instruments that are calibrated for one world but sensitive enough to pick up the edges of another. The historian's job is to be rigorous. To say we do not know. To say, the evidence is incomplete. To say, the rational explanation may well suffice. I've tried to do that job here. What I can tell you with certainty, 5 SS officers traveled to the Tibetan Plateau in 1938. Their mission had 2 faces, one scientific, one ideological. The scientific face produced real and lasting work. The ideological face produced files that are no longer accessible. What I can tell you with reasonable confidence, something occurred on the northeastern plateau in November of 1938 that caused a trained, disciplined, and professionally skeptical expedition leader to break camp in the middle of a sub-zero night, march his men through darkness for 4 hours, and never formally speak of it again. What I cannot tell you what it was. Whether the light beggar described was geophysical, ball lightning, bioluminescent gas venting from a fissure, refracted starlight, or something the Tibetan lamas understood better than the men in black uniforms who came looking for their mythology. Whether the radio transmission was atmospheric anomaly or something that the atmosphere merely carried. Whether the redacted section of Schäfer's interrogation contains a rational explanation, a classified one, or simply the account of a frightened man who had run out of rational frameworks. The legend of Agartha has been dismissed by every serious geologist who has ever encountered it, and rightly so. The Earth's interior is not a habitable kingdom. The physics are unambiguous on this point, but the Tibetan plateau is ancient in a way that the word ancient doesn't quite capture. The rock is Precambrian in places, over 500 million years old. The cave systems beneath those highlands have been mapped only partially even now. The plateau sits at the collision point of 2 of the Earth's largest tectonic plates, creating subsurface pressures and thermal gradients that are genuinely poorly understood. And the people who have lived on that plateau for centuries, who have worshipped there, navigated there, buried their dead in the permafrost, have maintained consistently and across generations that the ground beneath them is inhabited, not by geophysical processes, by something with intention. 5 German scientists stood on that ground in 1938 in the dark, watching light come up from below. One of them later asked in a classified memo that the place be left alone forever. We do not know if whatever they disturbed has, in the years since, settled back into silence. War creates many ghosts, but not all of them are human. If this investigation reached you, consider subscribing. More classified histories are being recovered.